It's the summer of 1942. Adolf Hitler controls more of Europe than any man since Napoleon. His armies occupy Norway to North Africa, Greece to the English Channel. His tanks are within striking distance of the Soviet oil fields. His submarines are strangling Britain's supply lines. His bombers have reduced cities to rubble from Warsaw to Rotterdam. He is, by every measurable standard, winning. Not just ahead, dominant. The United States has been in the war less than a year, and its army is still building. The Soviets are staggering backward, losing 1 million men every few months. Britain has nearly no army left on the European continent at all. Churchill is making speeches about fighting on the beaches, which is a lovely thing to say when that's literally all you have left. And then something extraordinary happens. In 12 months, just 12 months, the entire picture flips. By the summer of 1943, Germany has lost 250,000 soldiers at Stalingrad. Its Africa Corps has surrendered. The Allied armies have landed in Sicily. The German submarine menace has been broken. The strategic bombing campaign is turning German cities to ash. Mussolini, Hitler's oldest ally, is under arrest. And the tide of the Eastern Front has permanently, irreversibly turned. How? How does a man who controls an empire stretching from the Arctic to the Sahara lose everything in 12 months? The answer isn't simple. It never is. But it involves a series of decisions, some brilliant, some catastrophic, some made in fury, some made in hubris, that together form one of the most dramatic reversals in the history of warfare. And here's what makes it so haunting. Hitler saw it coming. Some part of him always did. There are moments, scattered through 1942, where the doubt surfaces, where his generals warn him, where the numbers stop adding up. And he silences them, one by one, because the alternative, admitting the war was lost, was something he could never do. This is the story of 12 months that changed the world. If stories like this are what you live for, hit that subscribe button right now. There are dozens more coming, and you won't want to miss a single one. To understand how far Hitler fell, you have to understand how high he stood. On June 28, 1942, Hitler launched Operation Blue, the massive summer offensive designed to seize the Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus and strangle the Red Army's fuel supply. Over 1 million German and Axis soldiers moved east and south simultaneously, driving through the open Russian steppe with a speed that stunned even optimistic German planners. Army Group South split into 2 prongs. Army Group A drove toward the Caucasus Mountains and the oil city of Baku. Army Group B pushed toward the Volga River and a city on its western bank called Stalingrad. In the first weeks, it looked like 1941 all over again. Soviet units collapsed. Prisoners were taken in the hundreds of thousands. The Luftwaffe owned the sky. German panzer commanders sent back reports that read almost like tourism brochures. Endless flat terrain. No serious resistance. The enemy breaking and running. Hitler was so confident he took personal command of both army groups simultaneously. He dismissed generals who raised concerns. He moved his headquarters temporarily to Vinnytsia in Ukraine, closer to the action. He called it Werewolf. Meanwhile, in North Africa, General Erwin Rommel was writing his name into legend. In June 1942, Rommel captured Tobruk, a port fortress the British had held for 8 months in a single day. Churchill learned the news while sitting with President Roosevelt in the White House. He called it one of the worst moments of the war. Roosevelt, rather than gloating, quietly asked what he could do to help. 300 Sherman tanks were loaded onto ships within the week. Rommel's Africa Corps pushed deep into Egypt. By late June, his forward units were at a small railway stop called El Alamein, just 60 miles from Alexandria, the the heart of British Egypt. One more push, and the Suez Canal falls. Rommel is promoted to Field Marshal. He is 49 years old. Back in Berlin, Hitler is giddy. His propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, writes in his diary that the Führer is in exceptional spirits, certain that the summer campaign will deliver the killing blow. Here's the lesser-known piece of that picture. Hitler's confidence was, at least partially, built on intelligence he should never have trusted. The Germans had cracked a critical American military intelligence channel, the reports filed by Colonel Bonner Fellers, the U.S. military attaché in Cairo, who was sending detailed assessments of British strength and weakness directly to Washington. The Germans were reading those cables in near real time. Rommel called Fellers' reports his good source. When the Americans finally changed their codes in late June 1942, Rommel later said it was like going blind overnight. So Hitler's empire in the summer of 1942 was built partly on a lie. An illusion of invincibility, fed by stolen intelligence, collapsing enemies, and generals too afraid to tell him the truth. The storm was already gathering. He just couldn't see it yet. There were men in Hitler's inner circle who understood, with absolute clarity, that Germany was walking toward a cliff. General Franz Halder was the chief of the Army General Staff. He was a meticulous Bavarian officer, trained in the old Prussian tradition, who kept detailed war diaries that have since become invaluable historical documents. By the summer of 1942, Halder was in private agony. He watched Hitler split Army Group South into two simultaneous drives, one toward the Caucasus, one toward Stalingrad, and he knew the math didn't work. Germany didn't have enough men, enough fuel, enough trucks to sustain both thrusts at full strength. One of them would have to be the priority. Hitler refused to choose. On September 24, 1942, the breaking point came. Hitler flew into a rage over what he called defeatism in the General Staff. Halder argued back. He told Hitler that the Soviet Union was producing 1,200 tanks a month. Hitler reportedly screamed that the figures were idiotic, that it was impossible, that his generals were feeding him lies. Halder was fired that afternoon. He had served as chief of staff for more than 5 years, through the fall of France, through the campaigns in the East. He was replaced by General Kurt Seitzler, a younger, more compliant officer Hitler trusted partly because he didn't argue. The pattern was already established. Anyone who told Hitler the truth was replaced by someone who would tell him what he wanted to hear. His armaments minister Albert Speer would later write that Hitler's headquarters had become a place where reality was systematically filtered out, where generals learned to phrase their reports in ways that minimized bad news because the alternative was dismissal, humiliation, or worse. There's a chilling entry from Halder's diary, written in July 1942, barely noticed at the time. He wrote that the Führer's decisions had ceased to have any connection with the principles of strategy and operations as they had been recognized for generations, that they were the product of a violent nature following its momentary impulses. He wrote this privately. He never said it to Hitler's face again, because by then, he knew it wouldn't matter. The men who saw the cliff coming were being driven away from the steering wheel, and Hitler was accelerating. Here's a question for you. If you were one of those generals, knowing the truth and knowing what happened to those who told it, would you have spoken up anyway? Drop your answer in the comments below. I want to know what you'd have done. While Hitler was planning his summer conquests, something was happening on the other side of the Atlantic that he genuinely underestimated, and arguably never fully understood. America was going to war. Not the cautious, limited kind of war it had fought in the early years of the First World War. A total, industrial, overwhelming war that would eventually produce more weapons, more ships, and more aircraft than the rest of the world combined. On January 6, 1942, less than a month after Pearl Harbor, Franklin Roosevelt addressed Congress and gave them the production figures he was demanding for the coming year. 60,000 aircraft, 45,000 tanks, 20,000 anti-aircraft guns, 8 million tons of shipping. The room went quiet. These weren't just ambitious numbers. They were, by the standards of 1942, almost incomprehensible. Roosevelt knew it. His generals knew it. But he also knew something that Hitler didn't. What America was capable of when fully committed. By the summer of 1942, the transformation was already underway. The Ford plant at Willow Run, Michigan, designed to build cars, was being converted to produce B-24 Liberator bombers. By 1944, it would produce one completed bomber every 63 minutes, 24 hours a day. Henry Kaiser's shipyards were launching a new Liberty ship every few days. Women who had never touched a rivet gun were building aircraft engines. Hitler had a name for American industrial capacity. He called it a bluff. He told his generals that American culture was too decadent, too commercially oriented to fight a real war. He pointed to the First World War and argued that American soldiers hadn't been decisive, that the war had ended before they could be tested. This was one of his most catastrophic miscalculations. And across the Pacific, America was already proving him wrong. On June 4, 1942, while Rommel was closing in on Tobruk, the U.S. Navy won one of the most improbable naval victories in history at Midway. 4 Japanese fleet carriers were sunk in a matter of hours. The Imperial Japanese Navy never fully recovered. America had been at war for 6 months and had already broken the back of its Pacific enemy's naval supremacy. Hitler barely mentioned it. He was a landman, a ground war man. But what Midway demonstrated was the thing that should have terrified him. American commanders, younger, more flexible, willing to take risks, were capable of adapting at a speed that Axis forces couldn't match. The sleeping giant was not just awake, it was already dangerous. On August 23, 1942, the German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, reached the Volga River north of Stalingrad. That same evening, over 600 Luftwaffe bombers struck the city in the largest aerial raid on a Soviet target to date. Stalingrad burned. The oil storage tanks along the Volga caught fire and poured burning fuel directly into the river. Survivors later described the Volga itself as being on fire. It looked like the end. Stalingrad, strategically, was not even the primary objective of Operation Blue. The Caucasus oil fields were the prize. Stalingrad was supposed to be a flank guard, a city to be masked or captured while the real prize was taken in the south. But the city had a name, Stalin City, and that changed everything. Hitler became personally fixated on taking it. Stalin became personally fixated on holding it. 2 dictators, each with massive egos and absolute power, each deciding this particular stretch of ruined urban landscape was worth any cost. They locked an entire war onto a single point. What followed was unlike anything the European war had yet produced. The Germans advanced into the city in September and October with fanatical ferocity, block by block, building by building, room by room. The fighting was so close that front lines shifted from staircase to staircase. German commanders later called it Rattenkrieg, rat war. Men fought with knives and entrenching tools in cellars and sewers. A single factory building changed hands 15 times. Soviet General Vasily Chuikov commanded the defending 62nd Army from a headquarters 40 yards from the front line. Artillery shells hit his command post daily. His communications staff learned to keep moving because anyone who stayed in one place too long died. He later wrote that they had to teach the German officers there was no safety zone, no rear, no place to rest. Here's the detail that historians still find remarkable. The Soviets crossed the Volga at night, under German fire, to reinforce the city. Every soldier who crossed knew they were going to a place where survival was measured in hours. They crossed anyway, night after night, in small boats, while German artillery tried to sink them. Casualty rates in some reinforcing units reached 50% before they even reached the western bank. The Soviets were not just defending Stalingrad, they were absorbing the German Sixth Army, the finest, best-equipped German formation on the Eastern Front, into a grinding nightmare from which it could not escape. While the Germans were consumed in the city, something else was being built to the north and south of them. Something that would change everything. At 7:20 in the morning on November 19, 1942, the Soviet artillery opened fire. Not in Stalingrad, to the northwest, against the German flanks. The Romanian Third Army was holding a line that stretched hundreds of miles with almost no armored reserves, no deep defensive positions, no way to stop what was coming. 3,500 Soviet guns fired simultaneously. For 80 minutes, they poured shells into Romanian positions that had never been properly fortified. Then the tanks came. Over 900 Soviet T-34s driving through morning fog and snow, punching through positions that simply ceased to exist. The following day, November 20th, a second attack struck from the south. Again against Romanian forces, again through positions that collapsed almost immediately. Within 4 days, the two Soviet spearheads met at the town of Kalach on the Don. The Sixth Army was surrounded. 330,000 German and Axis soldiers were encircled in a pocket on the steppe west of Stalingrad. The operation was called Uranus. It had been planned in total secrecy by Soviet generals Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, built over weeks while the battle for the city consumed German attention. The Soviets moved 8 armies into position, 17 divisions, over 1 million men, without the Germans detecting the preparation. This was not luck. It was operational mastery of the highest order. Paulus, commanding the Sixth Army, recognized almost immediately that his only chance was to break out southwest before the pocket solidified. He requested permission from Hitler to retreat. Hitler denied it. He told Paulus the Sixth Army would be supplied by air and that a relief force was being organized. He told him to hold. General Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe and one of Hitler's most loyal Inner Circle members, had promised Hitler that his aircraft could supply the Sixth Army. He said it required 500 tons of supplies per day. His own officers told him privately that the maximum they could deliver, in ideal conditions, was 350 tons. In the conditions of a Russian winter, fog, snow, ice, Soviet fighters, the actual deliveries averaged less than 100 tons a day. The soldiers inside the pocket had rations cut in half, then cut again. The horses were eaten, then the leather from their equipment. In December, the temperature dropped to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. A relief force launched on December 12th under General Erich von Manstein. It drove toward the pocket but stalled 60 miles short. Manstein wanted Paulus to break out toward him. Hitler refused to authorize the move. Manstein later wrote, with considerable bitterness, that the Sixth Army could have been saved if Hitler had given the order. He didn't. By December, everyone inside the pocket understood what was happening. Some of them were writing their final letters home. Think about that. Do you think Paulus should have broken out anyway, against direct orders? Or was he right to obey? Tell me in the comments. There's no clean answer, and that's what makes this question so powerful. While the trap was closing at Stalingrad, 2,000 miles to the southwest, another reversal was unfolding in the Egyptian desert. Rommel was exhausted. Not just physically, though that was true too. He was fighting a war he could no longer sustain. His supply lines stretched back to Tripoli, nearly 1,000 miles. The Royal Navy was sinking his supply ships. The Royal Air Force was bombing his fuel depots. The brilliant, daring flanking sweeps that had made him famous required fuel, and by October 1942, his armored divisions had enough fuel for roughly 3 days of intensive combat. The man commanding the British Eighth Army opposite him was General Bernard Montgomery. Montgomery had arrived in August, imposed brutal discipline on the Eighth Army, and spent the following weeks building up supplies and training his men with an almost obsessive patience. He was not beloved by everyone. Churchill found him infuriating, but he was methodical, and methodology was what the moment required. On the night of October 23, 1942, the Second Battle of El Alamein began with 882 artillery guns firing simultaneously along a 40-mile front. It was the heaviest barrage the Western Desert had seen. For 5 hours, it tore apart Rommel's forward defenses. Rommel wasn't even in Africa when it started. He was in Germany, recovering from illness. He flew back within 24 hours, but the situation was already deteriorating. Montgomery's plan was methodical and brutal. British and Commonwealth infantry cleared lanes through Rommel's minefields, hundreds of thousands of mines, in some places laid 4 rows deep, while engineers worked under fire to open corridors for armor. It took 2 weeks of grinding, costly fighting. When the breakthrough came on November 2nd, it was irresistible. Rommel's armor was reduced to fewer than 30 operational tanks. He had no fuel to maneuver, no reserves to commit, no ability to stabilize the front. He sent Hitler a message saying he intended to retreat. Hitler sent back the order that is now infamous in German military history. He told Rommel that in his present situation, nothing else could be considered but to hold on, not to yield one step, to throw every gun and every man into the battle, that his troops could be shown no other road than that to victory or death. Rommel ignored it. He retreated anyway. It was the only sensible decision. But the exchange illuminates something important. By late 1942, Hitler's orders had become disconnected from military reality. He was issuing commands based on will and ideology, not terrain, supply, or arithmetic. And the gap between what he ordered and what was physically possible was growing wider every week. 3 days after El Alamein, on November 8th, American and British forces landed in Morocco and Algeria. Operation Torch placed a new army on Rommel's western flank. The Africa Corps was now trapped between 2 converging Allied forces. Rommel's days in Africa were numbered. He just didn't know how few were left. Here's the question I keep coming back to. If you were Rommel in October 1942, an exhausted general with no fuel, no reinforcements, facing a prepared enemy with vastly superior supplies, would you have followed Hitler's victory or death order? Or would you have done exactly what Rommel did and trusted your own military judgment over the command of a man who wasn't there? Drop your answer in the comments. This is one of the most debated decisions of the entire war. There's a dimension of this reversal that doesn't get enough attention in most accounts of the war. The Battle of the Atlantic, which nearly ended everything. Not just British supply lines, everything. In 1942, German U-boats sank more than 1,600 Allied ships, over 6 million tons of supplies. In the first months of 1943, the rate was still accelerating. Admiral Karl Donitz, commanding the German submarine fleet, told Hitler that if the rate could be maintained, Britain would be unable to sustain the war. The mathematics were brutal. The Allies were building ships slower than Donitz was sinking them. In the worst month, March 1943, U-boats sank over 700,000 tons of Allied shipping in a single month. The British Admiralty privately assessed that if the rate continued for another 4 months, the strategic position would become untenable. The men who died in the Atlantic died in ways that haunt the imagination. Ships sank in minutes when torpedoed, sometimes in the middle of the night in storm-force seas. Merchant sailors, civilians, not soldiers, floated in water that in the North Atlantic in winter was cold enough to kill in 15 minutes. Convoy survivors described the sound of men drowning in the dark, the smell of burning oil on the water, the silence that followed. And then, in roughly 8 weeks in the spring of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic swung completely. Long-range aircraft began closing the mid-Atlantic gap, the region beyond the range of land-based planes where U-boats had operated with relative impunity. Escort carriers brought air cover directly to the convoys. New radar technology meant U-boats could no longer safely surface to recharge their batteries. The British codebreakers at Bletchley Park were providing increasingly precise intelligence on U-boat positions. In May 1943 alone, the Allies sank 41 U-boats. Dönitz lost a third of his operational force in 4 weeks. He pulled his submarines from the North Atlantic convoy routes on May 24, 1943, acknowledging the campaign had failed. He wrote to Hitler that the enemy had rendered the U-boat war ineffective and that they were facing the greatest difficulty they had met until now. Hitler, by this point, had become someone who found bad news almost physically intolerable. The messenger, increasingly, paid for the message. If this story is grabbing you, this is a great time to subscribe. Every week I'm covering the battles, decisions, and turning points that changed the world. You won't find this depth anywhere else on YouTube. By January 1943, the men inside the Stalingrad pocket were dying. Not just from combat, from starvation, from frostbite, from disease, from despair. Rations had been cut to 200 grams of bread per day, about the size of a fist. The temperature was regularly reaching -40. Men whose boots had worn through wrapped their feet in rags, then in scraps of vehicle upholstery, then in anything they could find. Frostbite amputations were being performed without anesthesia in ruins that served as field hospitals. The Soviet ring was tightening from all sides. On January 10th, Soviet Marshal Rokossovsky launched Operation Ring. 47 Soviet divisions, 5,600 artillery pieces, 170 tanks, attacking a pocket of perhaps 100,000 surviving German soldiers, most of them already too weakened to fight effectively. Hitler, on January 30th, 1943, promoted Friedrich Paulus to Field Marshal. It was the highest rank in the German military. No German field marshal had ever surrendered in battle. The message was unmistakable. Hitler expected Paulus to die rather than give up. Paulus surrendered the following day. He was found in the basement of the ruined Univermag department store in central Stalingrad. Haggard, unshaven, suffering from nervous exhaustion. When the Soviet officers arrived to take him into custody, he was sitting on a mattress on a concrete floor, wrapped in a coat, looking, according to one Soviet account, like a man who had been waiting for this for a very long time. The northern pocket held out until February 2nd. When it fell, Soviet forces counted 91,000 prisoners. They had started with 330,000 men inside the pocket. The difference, roughly 240,000, were dead. Of the 91,000 captured, fewer than 6,000 would ever return to Germany. The Russian camps, the brutal winters, the hunger, the disease, they consumed the rest. In Germany, when the news was announced on February 3rd, Hitler declared 3 days of national mourning. Theaters and cinemas closed. Goebbels broadcast a solemn address. He described it as a sacrifice that would inspire future generations. But the German public understood something that Goebbels couldn't quite cover with words. The Sixth Army, 300,000 men, was gone. Cities all over Germany had men in that army. Every family and dozens of communities knew someone inside that pocket. The letters from the final airlift, the last bags of mail flown out before the pocket was fully sealed, were arriving in German homes that February. Final letters from men who knew they were going to die. Could Stalingrad have been avoided? Some historians argue that if Hitler had authorized a breakout in November or December, the Sixth Army might have escaped with heavy losses, but survived. Others contend the situation on the flanks was so desperate that any retreat would have collapsed into a rout. The truth is probably somewhere between. There was a window, brief and narrow and real, when escape might have been possible. Hitler closed it. And the war had changed forever. By the spring of 1943, a massive Soviet salient had developed around the city of Kursk in southern Russia. German lines curved around it on both sides, creating an obvious opportunity. Pinch the salient from north and south, encircle the forces inside, and deal a devastating blow. Hitler's generals drew up Operation Citadel. Massive armored forces, including the new Tiger and Panther tanks, would drive from both flanks and meet in the middle. The Soviets knew it was coming. British intelligence had identified the planned operation. The Soviets built the deepest, most elaborate defensive network in the history of warfare. 8 defensive belts, one behind another, extending up to 200 miles deep. 6,000 miles of trenches, 500,000 mines, roughly 1 mine for every 2 yards of front. Hundreds of anti-tank guns positioned in depth, designed to stop German armor cold. The battle began on July 5, 1943. The German northern thrust stalled almost immediately against defenses the attackers hadn't expected to be so deep. The southern thrust made more progress, but at horrifying cost. Near a village called Prokhorovka, on July 12th, the largest tank battle in history erupted. Hundreds of Soviet and German tanks clashing at close range in a melee that left the field covered in burning metal. The Germans failed to break through. After a week of losses they couldn't absorb, Hitler called off the operation on July 13th, partly because news had just arrived that Allied forces had landed in Sicily. He was pulling armored reserves out of the east to deal with the Mediterranean threat. The Soviets immediately launched massive counterattacks. They never stopped. From July 1943 onward, the German army on the Eastern Front was in continuous retreat. Kursk was the last time Germany held the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. After Kursk, it was over. Not tomorrow, not next month. But the trajectory was set, and everyone who looked honestly at the numbers understood it. If this video is changing how you see this war, hit that like button. It genuinely helps other history lovers find this channel. And drop a comment telling me, which battle in this story hits you hardest? Stalingrad, Kursk, El Alamein? I read every single one. Most Americans know D-Day, June 6, 1944. The beaches of Normandy, the greatest amphibious assault in history. It was extraordinary. It was heroic. And it completely overshadowed something that happened 3 weeks later that was, in purely military terms, even more devastating. On June 23, 1944, exactly 3 years after Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union began, the Red Army launched Operation Bagration. It was named after a Russian general who died fighting Napoleon, and what it did to Army Group Center was nothing short of annihilation. Army Group Center was the backbone of Germany's Eastern Front defense. It held a line stretching hundreds of miles through what is now Belarus. It had roughly 850,000 men, 553 tanks and assault guns, and 9,500 artillery pieces. It was a powerful, experienced force. the same general structure that had swept to the gates of Moscow in 1941. In 6 weeks, it ceased to exist. The Soviets committed 2.3 million men, 5,200 tanks, and over 5,000 aircraft. But the numbers alone don't explain what happened. The planning was the thing. Soviet general staff planners had spent months building a deception operation called Maskirovka that convinced the Germans the main blow was coming somewhere else entirely. Fake radio traffic, fake troop movements, real armored units moved only at night under strict radio silence. When Bagration hit, it hit where the Germans weren't looking. Within days, the Soviet spearheads were driving 20 to 30 miles per day, the kind of operational speed that had belonged exclusively to German panzer commanders in 1941. German divisions that tried to hold their positions were surrounded. German divisions that tried to retreat were overtaken. The communications network collapsed. Commanders lost contact with their units. Some units simply stopped existing. Hitler had designated several cities as fortified places and ordered their garrisons to hold to the last man, drawing supplies by air. The concept was a copy of what he'd attempted at Stalingrad, with identical results. Vitebsk fell on June 27th. Minsk fell on July 3rd. The Soviet encirclement at Minsk trapped roughly 100,000 German soldiers. Germany lost 28 divisions. 28 entire divisions, destroyed, shattered, or captured. Army Group Center, as a functioning military formation, had to be rebuilt almost from scratch. On July 17, 1944, the Soviets marched 57,000 German prisoners of war through the streets of Moscow. The procession took 90 minutes. Stalin arranged it deliberately. He wanted his people to see the Germans as defeated, diminished, broken. The prisoners shuffled through in long columns while Moscow's citizens lined the streets. The Soviets swept the streets clean behind them. The symbolism was unmistakable. Here's the detail that still stuns military historians. Bagration happened at the same time as Normandy. For 6 weeks in June and July 1944, Germany was being torn apart simultaneously from the west by American and British forces, and from the east by the largest Soviet offensive of the entire war. Hitler's response? His no-retreat orders, the same orders that had sealed Paulus's fate at Stalingrad, the same orders that had ground down his armies at Kursk, applied across the board. Hold. Stand fast. Every position is sacred. Every retreat is treason. His generals begged for permission to give ground intelligently, to preserve their forces, to create new defensive lines further west. He refused again and again in conference after conference with the same trembling fury that had become his trademark. By the end of Bagration, the Soviet army stood on the Vistula River, the doorstep of Warsaw, 200 miles from Berlin. The knockout blow had been thrown. It just took another 9 months to land. Here's something to sit with. Most people in America have never even heard of Operation Bagration. But military historians consider it one of the most decisive operations of the entire Second World War. More devastating than D-Day in terms of German losses. Why do you think it gets so little attention in Western history books? Drop your honest answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think. Here's something nobody talks about enough, and it matters more than almost anything else in this story. Hitler had the best tanks in the world. The Tiger I and Tiger II were engineering marvels, heavily armored, powerfully gunned, capable of destroying any Allied tank at ranges that Allied tanks couldn't match. The Panther, introduced in 1943, was arguably the best all-around tank of the entire war. But by 1944, those tanks were sitting still. Thousands of them, parked in fields, on roadsides, outside villages. Not because they'd been knocked out in battle, but because they had no fuel to move. Germany had almost no natural oil reserves. It had built a network of synthetic fuel plants that converted coal to aviation fuel and vehicle fuel through a complex chemical process. These plants, by 1944, were producing nearly all of Germany's aviation fuel and a substantial fraction of its vehicle fuel. They were also enormous, stationary, and visible from the air. On May 12, 1944, 3 weeks before D-Day, the U.S. 8th Air Force sent 935 bombers against the synthetic fuel plants. The largest, at Luna in Saxony, was heavily damaged. Production dropped by over 90%. The Luftwaffe scrambled every available fighter to defend these targets because their commanders understood, with terrible clarity, what losing them meant. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, drove immediately to Leuna to assess the damage himself. What he saw made him go straight to Hitler. He told Hitler that if the Allies continued targeting synthetic fuel, the war could be lost within months, not years, months. Hitler listened. Then he moved on to other topics. By June 1944, aviation fuel production had dropped by 90% from its peak. The Luftwaffe was grounded much of the time, simply because there was no fuel to fly. Pilots were being trained with drastically reduced flight hours. By late 1944, some German pilot training programs had been reduced to fewer than 50 hours of flight time before pilots were sent into combat, against American pilots with 400 hours. On the ground, tank commanders received fuel allocations that allowed perhaps 1 day of combat operations. Panzer divisions ordered to counterattack had to tow their tanks partway to preserve fuel for the actual engagement. Supply convoys ran out of fuel and were abandoned by the roadside. In the Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, in December 1944, Hitler's grand plan depended on German armored units capturing American fuel dumps to continue their advance. They didn't. The advance stalled short of the fuel they needed to keep moving, and then the Allied response closed in around them. A Waffen-SS Panzer commander, captured after the Ardennes, said something that historians have never forgotten. He said they knew the attack would fail, not because of the Americans, because of the fuel. They had enough to go perhaps 150 kilometers if everything went perfectly. Everything never goes perfectly. Hitler had the world's best tanks. They were expensive steel coffins with no fuel to move. The bombers had decided the war, not in a single dramatic day, but slowly, relentlessly, over months, suffocating Germany's ability to fight not by destroying its armies directly, but by removing the blood that ran through its military machine. Oil. It always comes back to oil. And here's the irony that haunts the entire story. Fall Blau, the 1942 offensive that started this whole unraveling, had been designed to capture Soviet oil fields. Hitler had understood in 1942 that oil was the decisive resource. He sent 1 million men to get it. He never did. Picture a claw, not a metaphor. A literal military claw, closing from 2 directions simultaneously, with the Third Reich trapped in the middle. On one side, the United States, Britain, and Canada, generating a tide of industrial output that Germany couldn't match in 10 years of full mobilization. On the other, the Soviet Union, which had taken the most catastrophic military losses in history and was still producing more tanks, more guns, and more soldiers than Germany could field. Let's put numbers to this, because the numbers are the story. In 1944, the United States produced 96,000 aircraft. Germany produced 39,000. America produced twice as many planes as Germany. And that's without counting British, Soviet, or Canadian production. America also produced 17,565 tanks in 1944. Germany produced 8,328. The Soviet Union, in the same year, produced 28,963 tanks. Read that again. The Soviet Union alone produced 3.5 times as many tanks as Germany in 1944. The Soviets had relocated over 2,500 factories east of the Ural Mountains after the German invasion in 1941. Entire factory complexes were dismantled, loaded onto rail cars, shipped thousands of miles east, and reassembled in Siberian cities where German bombers couldn't reach. Workers lived in tents next to the reassembled factories while production resumed. They worked in temperatures of -30 degrees, in buildings without roofs, because the walls were up and the machines were running and the roof could wait. At the Ural Tank Factory at Nizhny Tagil, production reached 35 T-34 tanks per day. On the American side, Henry Kaiser's shipyards were launching a new Liberty ship every few days. Willow Run was producing a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. The Douglas Aircraft Plant in Long Beach was building C-47 transport aircraft at rates that would have seemed fantastical in 1939. Now picture the German soldier in the middle of this. He's fighting on two fronts simultaneously, and those fronts are getting closer to the German heartland every month. The road network behind him is being bombed. His fuel supply has been cut. His replacement soldiers are younger and younger. By 1944, the Wehrmacht was drafting 16-year-olds. His tanks, when he has them, are superb but immobile. His Air Force, once the terror of Europe, has largely disappeared from the sky. And he's fighting soldiers who, on both sides, are getting better every month. The American Army of 1944 was not the same army that stumbled in North Africa in 1942. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, German forces had routed Green American units and inflicted shocking casualties. The Americans had learned from that. The army that landed in Normandy in June 1944, experienced, aggressive, supplied with overwhelming firepower, bore almost no resemblance to the army that had first entered the war. Soviet commanders, similarly, had evolved from the catastrophically led armies of 1941 into some of the finest operational planners of the war. Zhukov, Rokossovsky, Konev, Vasilevsky. These men had absorbed the lessons of the early disasters and built a Red Army that by 1944 was conducting combined arms operations with a sophistication that impressed even Western Allied observers. Germany was being squeezed by two armies that were improving while Germany's was deteriorating. The Iron Claw was closing. And Hitler, in his increasingly disconnected war conferences, surrounded by men too afraid to tell him the truth, was still planning counterattacks. Here's a question that keeps historians up at night. If Germany had somehow achieved peace with either the Soviets or the Western Allies in 1943, and fought on just one front, could it have survived? What do you think? Leave your take in the comments. Some of the answers I've read on questions like this have genuinely surprised me. In the German armaments ministry, the production numbers looked almost promising. Albert Speer had worked something close to a miracle since taking over as armaments minister in February 1942. He reorganized German industry, cut through bureaucratic overlap, rationalized production. Tank production tripled between 1942 and 1944. Artillery output quadrupled. Ammunition production reached levels that would have seemed impossible in the early war years. On paper, Germany was arming itself to fight. But there was a problem, a devastating war-ending problem that the production numbers completely concealed. The weapons weren't reaching the front. The German railway system, the Reichsbahn, was the circulatory system of the entire German war machine. Weapons from factories in the Ruhr and Silesia, fuel from refineries and synthetic plants, ammunition from storage depots, replacement soldiers from training camps, all of it moved by rail. And by 1944, That railway system was being systematically destroyed. Allied strategic bombers had shifted a significant portion of their effort to transportation bombing. Rail yards, marshalling stations, locomotive factories, bridges over major rivers. In some months of 1944, the German rail system was moving at less than half its pre-war capacity. Major rail hubs were bombed repeatedly, repaired, and bombed again. Speer's diaries contain an entry from late 1944 that cuts to the heart of it. Production output was still relatively high, he wrote, but the weapons were piling up at the factories because the trains weren't moving. Tanks sat in factory yards waiting for flat cars that never arrived. Ammunition that had been produced sat in warehouses, while frontline units reported critical shortages. A German infantry division in France or Poland in 1944 might receive, in a given week, perhaps 30% of the ammunition it needed to fight effectively. Panzer units received replacement vehicles at a fraction of their attrition rate. Artillery units were rationed to a specific number of shells per gun per day. There's a document from the German Army Group B logistics chief, dated October 1944, that has become something of a landmark in the history of German supply failure. He listed in detail what his command had been promised in terms of supply deliveries and what had actually arrived. The gap was roughly 60%. 60% of promised supplies simply hadn't gotten there. The pipeline was broken at every joint. Synthetic fuel plants were being bombed, so fuel wasn't being produced. Railroads were being bombed, so the fuel that was produced wasn't being transported. Oil storage facilities were being bombed, so strategic reserves were gone. And then the tanks sat still, and the aircraft stayed grounded, and the soldiers walked when they should have ridden. Speer had a phrase for this, used in his post-war testimony. He called it the logistics of illusion. Germany's production statistics created the illusion of military strength. The reality, at the sharp end of the spear, was an army increasingly fighting with whatever it could scavenge from the dead. And Hitler's response to all of this? In his war conferences, he demanded more production, more tanks, more planes, more guns. He spoke of secret weapons, the V-1 and V-2 rockets, the jet-powered Me-262, as if a technological breakthrough would compensate for the broken supply chain, the burned railways, the empty fuel tanks. The weapons existed. Some of them were extraordinary. The Me-262 jet fighter, when it occasionally flew, was faster than anything the Allies had. The V-2 rocket was genuinely terrifying. But they couldn't win a war that had already been decided in the factories of Michigan and the Ural Mountains, in the fuel dumps of Allied supply lines, and the bombed-out ruins of German ones. Paper production and battlefield reality had separated completely, and in the gap between them, the Third Reich was dying. By the end of 1943, those who saw Hitler regularly were struck by a physical change. He was 54 years old, but he moved like a much older man. His left hand trembled so badly that he hid it behind his back at public appearances, or gripped it with his right hand. His posture had developed a noticeable stoop. His face had grown lined and gray. His sleep was shattered and irregular, but physically was the least of it. What was happening inside his mind was more consequential for the war. Hitler had always possessed a tendency to dismiss information that contradicted his worldview. By 1943, this tendency had become absolute. He would not hear casualty figures he didn't believe. He would not examine maps that showed retreating lines. His conferences grew longer and more divorced from reality. He would spend hours discussing hypothetical offensives while his generals tried desperately to address actual crises on actual fronts. General Heinz Guderian, one of the architects of German armored warfare, was recalled to serve as Inspector General of Panzer Troops in 1943. He later wrote about his meetings with Hitler with a mixture of military precision and barely suppressed horror. He described a man who could discuss tank specifications in intricate detail, who could recite production statistics from memory, but who had lost the ability to translate that knowledge into operational reality, who could not accept that the war on the ground was no longer what he believed it to be. There's a telling episode from late 1943. During a conference, a general attempted to show Hitler a situation map indicating that a particular army group was being dangerously outflanked. Hitler refused to look at the map. He insisted the information was inaccurate. When the general pressed him, Hitler stood up and walked to the window. He stood there for several minutes, looking out, saying nothing. Then he turned around and began discussing something else entirely. Some historians argue this was deliberate manipulation, Hitler controlling the conversation by refusing to engage with inconvenient truths. Others suggest it was something more concerning. A man who had genuinely lost the capacity to process information that threatened his self-image. What's not debated is the outcome. Every major strategic decision from 1943 onward made Germany's position worse. The refusal to allow tactical retreats burned through irreplaceable manpower. Albert Speer testified at Nuremberg that Germany could have doubled its weapons output years earlier if the administration had been organized properly. It wasn't, because Hitler distrusted bureaucracy, distrusted planning, and made decisions based on intuition rather than analysis. He had won stunning victories that way. Poland, France, the opening of Barbarossa, and those victories had convinced him that his intuition was superior to his general's expertise. It wasn't. The picture was collapsing on every front. In May 1943, the last Axis forces in North Africa surrendered near Tunis and Cape Bon. Over 250,000 German and Italian soldiers marched into Allied captivity, more prisoners than at Stalingrad. Rommel himself had been recalled to Germany weeks earlier, ostensibly for medical treatment. He was never sent back. Hitler knew Africa was finished, even as his public statements insisted otherwise. The Afrika Korps, the legend of the Desert War, the force that had driven to the gates of Alexandria, ceased to exist. 2 months later, on July 10, 1943, Allied forces landed in Sicily. American and British armies under Generals George Patton and Bernard Montgomery drove across the island against fierce resistance. Sicily fell in 38 days. And then Italy fell apart. On July 25, 1943, less than 3 weeks after the Sicily landings, Benito Mussolini was voted out of power by his own Grand Council, arrested on the orders of King Victor Emmanuel, and driven away in an ambulance. The fascist dictator who had been Hitler's closest ally, the man who had helped inspire his political movement, was in prison. When Hitler received the news, he was at his headquarters watching aerial reconnaissance footage. An aide broke in and told him. By multiple accounts, Hitler went completely still for a long moment. Then he began planning. He would rescue Mussolini, reinstall him, and continue the war. He did rescue Mussolini in a dramatic glider raid on September 12th by German special forces. But the Italy of that rescue wasn't the Italy of 1940. It was a broken country whose people had already decided the war was someone else's problem. On September 8th, the Italian government announced an armistice with the Allies. German forces immediately occupied the country and disarmed Italian units. Italy was now a battleground, not an ally. The war had come to southern Europe. At Stalingrad, roughly 840,000 German and Axis casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. Soviet military losses in the campaign, approximately 1.1 million. Civilian deaths in the city itself, disputed but estimated in the tens of thousands. The city was so thoroughly destroyed that in some sectors, not a single building remained standing. In North Africa, over 350,000 Axis prisoners taken in the final Tunisian collapse alone. In the Atlantic in 1942 alone, approximately 1,600 Allied ships sunk. Thousands of merchant sailors and naval personnel died in cold water. The U-boat service itself suffered catastrophic losses. Over 28,000 U-boat crewmen died in the entire war, more than 75% of the men who served. At Kursk, Germany permanently lost the strategic initiative. In Bagration, 28 divisions erased. These weren't statistics when they happened. They were fathers, sons, brothers, husbands. A Soviet infantryman at Stalingrad averaged a life expectancy, in the worst periods of the fighting, of 24 hours after crossing the Volga. A British merchant sailor in the Atlantic in 1942 had roughly a 1 in 8 chance of dying in his service. A German soldier captured at Stalingrad had roughly a 1 in 15 chance of returning home. The human cost of these months is almost too large to comprehend honestly. And it was only the beginning. The war had nearly 2 more years to run. So here we are, at the end of the story. And there's a question I want to leave you with. Not because there's a clean answer, but because the question itself is the point. Was it the Soviet winter that killed the Third Reich? The winter of 1941 and 1942 had already broken the first German advance on Moscow. The winter of 1942 and 1943 sealed Stalingrad. The Russian geography, the vast distances, the brutal cold, the roads that turned to mud in autumn and became impassable ice in winter, had defeated Napoleon, and it bled Germany white. The sheer human mass of the Soviet Union, its willingness to absorb casualties that would have shattered any Western nation, its ability to keep producing soldiers and tanks and shells even as whole armies died. This was a force of nature that no military genius could have fully accounted for. Was it the American factories that killed the Third Reich? 96,000 aircraft in 1944, one new warship every few days, bombers appearing over Germany in formations of 1,000 planes at a time. The systematic destruction of every synthetic fuel plant, every rail yard, every critical choke point in the German war machine. Lend-Lease supplying the Soviet Union with the trucks and food that freed Russian factories to make nothing but weapons. The sheer, almost inhuman productivity of American industry. This was something Hitler had called a bluff and had never really believed. Or was it Hitler's own ego that killed the Third Reich? Every no-retreat order that burned through irreplaceable divisions. Every general fired for telling the truth. Every intelligence assessment rejected because it contradicted what he wanted to believe. Halder's diary. Paulus in the basement of a department store. The Sixth Army sealed in a pocket because one man couldn't admit he was wrong. Operation Bagration consuming 28 divisions because their commanders weren't allowed to conduct an elastic defense. A man who had won his early victories through bold, unconventional thinking and had then become so convinced of his own infallibility that he couldn't stop doing what had worked in 1940 in a world that had completely changed. The honest answer, the historically accurate answer, is all three. They were not separate causes. They fed each other, amplified each other, collided in those catastrophic months to produce an outcome that, looking back, seems almost inevitable, but wasn't. There were moments, narrow and fleeting and real, when different decisions could have produced different results. If Hitler had authorized a breakout at Stalingrad in November 1942, if the synthetic fuel plants had been properly defended before the bombing campaign began, if Bagration had been met with the kind of flexible defense his generals were begging to conduct, we'll never know. History doesn't run the alternative scenarios. What it gives us instead is a case study in how empires fall. Not always from outside assault. Not always from superior enemies. Sometimes from the inside out. From the accumulated weight of bad decisions made by a man who had convinced himself and everyone around him that he couldn't be wrong. The Soviet winter froze his armies. The American factories outproduced him. His own ego destroyed his ability to respond. And the world, at a cost measured in tens of millions of human lives, began again. A German soldier at Stalingrad wrote his last letter home in January 1943. He wrote that fates were decided there, that what he was writing was the truth, that in 6 weeks it would be over. He was right. It was. And 70 years later, sitting here, looking back at those 12 months, from the summer of 1942 to the summer of 1943, and the years of consequence that followed, the only honest response is grief. For the dead, for the waste, for the truth that the lessons were never quite as fully learned as they should have been. But also, and this matters, recognition. Recognition of the men and women on the Allied side who, through courage and stubbornness and industrial genius and sheer refusal to quit, stopped the most dangerous totalitarian project in modern history. They deserve to be remembered. All of them. So here's my final question for you, and I want you to take it seriously. Which force do you think was most decisive? The Soviet winter, the American factories, or Hitler's own ego? Choose one. Defend your answer in the comments, and read what other people think. Because the best discussions on this channel don't happen on screen. They happen down below. If this story moved you, or taught you something, or made you see this war differently, hit that like button and subscribe. Every week, we go deeper into the history that shaped the world you're living in right now. And there is so much more to come.